Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlight Series. Today we focus on analyzing primary source documents pertaining to international incidents to determine the course of action taken by the United States. We focus on analyzing primary source documents, and it is through these documents that we will develop a good understanding of why and how the United States responded to international incidents. We ask, how do these primary sources demonstrate evidence of international incidents that determine the course of action taken by the United States? We're going to be focusing on 4 wars in this presentation. The first 2 wars were declared wars. This means that the United States Congress formally declared war on at least one other nation in order to enter the wars that are described. These wars will be World War I and World War II. World War I and World War II are the last 2 wars that the United States formally entered using the declaration of war power that is outlined in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. In the second 2 wars, we'll be focusing on undeclared wars. This means that the United States took action that very much looked like a war, but Congress did not declare war on any nation in order to participate in these particular wars. Those wars will be the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Let's focus our attention now on World War I. World War I began in 1914 and ended in 1918. However, the United States did not enter the war until 1917, and the United States declared war on Germany when it entered the war in 1917. President Woodrow Wilson, in asking Congress to declare war on April 2, 1917, asked the Congress, saying, "I have called the Congress into extraordinary session because there are serious, very serious choices of policy to be made, and made immediately, which it was neither right nor constitutionally permissible that I should assume the responsibility of making." So this particular excerpt is really very interesting because President Wilson is recognizing how the separation of powers system works. What we're looking at now is not an example of checks and balances, because President Wilson, as president and as commander-in-chief, had no power when it came to declaring war. That power is reserved solely to the United States Congress and is not subject to a veto. And you see the language that President Wilson provides. It is not constitutionally permissible. Therefore, I am asking you, Congress, to take this very serious step. Now we look at World War II. World War II began in 1939, ending in 1945, although the United States entered this war in 1941. So why did the United States enter this war? It is because on December 7th, 1941, that the Japanese army attacked Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii, but at the time, Hawaii was a U.S. territory and not a state. And so because this was an attack on the United States, because it was an attack on a U.S. territory, Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time, approached Congress the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor and asked Congress to declare war. Looking at this speech, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I, the President, am asking Congress to make this declaration of war. So similar to President Wilson in World War I, it was up to President Roosevelt to ask Congress to exercise its constitutional authority in Article 1, Section 8. And President Roosevelt understood that unless he was convincing to Congress, that it may be that some members of Congress may oppose the president's request, and if not enough members of Congress supported the president's request, then Congress would not have declared war on Japan. So it was really very important to President Roosevelt to be convincing. So look at some of the language that President Roosevelt uses. Unprovoked attack, dastardly attack. We are now in a state of war. A sudden attack, a deliberate attack. So he's using this very strong language in order to convince Congress, not that many of them needed convincing, but in order to convince Congress to take this particular action in light of how war powers function in a separation of power system in this particular instance, where the president has no check, the president has no veto power on a declaration of war. The president can only ask for a declaration of war. And if the president opposes a declaration of war, the president must still follow through with a declaration of war if that's what Congress decides. Now we're going to focus our attention on two undeclared wars. Here we see during the Korean War in 1950, President Harry Truman, who was making a statement on the situation in Korea. In Korea, the government forces were attacked by invading forces from North Korea. Now, in a document that was published in the 1800s, Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto a phrase that's translated into "Workers of the world unite." What does that mean in the present context, workers of the world unite? What this means is that in order for communism to exist and to thrive, communism must cross national borders to unite workers. So North Korea had invaded South Korea in order to ostensibly connect and unite these workers of the world. So that is one of the reasons why North Korea invaded South Korea, was to practice and exercise communism as listed and as discussed and described in the Communist Manifesto. So here President Truman says, I have ordered United States Air and Sea Forces to give the Korean government, meaning the South Korean government, which was a democratic government, troops, cover, and support. We also see a difference between what President Truman did in the present situation versus the other two wars. The previous wars, when the president was seeking a declaration of war from Congress, the president spoke directly to Congress. Here, President Truman is speaking to the people, and he's asking the people for their support for what he has done as commander-in-chief. Notice the pronoun I. I have ordered United States Air and Sea Forces. And so we see that the audience went from Congress for World War I and World War II to the people. We also see the roles change. We went from Congress having the power in the declaration of war to in the Korean War situation where the president used his commander-in-chief power, which is included in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Then we look at the Vietnam War, a joint resolution adopted by the U.S. Congress, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Here, this is an action of Congress that the President Johnson had requested to give him more authority to exercise his role as commander-in-chief without a declaration of war. And so here we see that the Congress is providing its approval to the president to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the U.S. and to prevent further aggression. Why was there aggression? Because North Vietnam was communist and it was trying to spread to South Vietnam. So we do see these very interesting situations when it comes to understanding how primary sources help us to learn about how the United States responded to international conflict. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.